For more than 2 decades, one of New York's most heartbreaking missing child cases seemed impossible to solve. A baby disappeared from a hospital without a struggle, no alarms, no witnesses who could identify the person responsible. She simply vanished. Her parents spent years wondering whether she was still alive. Investigators followed countless leads. None of them brought their daughter home. Then something happened that almost no one could have predicted. The missing child, now a young woman, began asking questions about her own identity. The answers she uncovered would expose a deception that had lasted more than 20 years, and it would lead to one of the most extraordinary family reunions in American history. This is the true story of Carlina White. The summer of 1987 should have marked the beginning of a family's happiest chapter. 22-year-old Joy White had just given birth to a healthy baby girl at Harlem Hospital Center in New York City. Despite a difficult pregnancy, both mother and daughter were expected to recover well. The newborn was named Carlina. For Joy and her husband, Carl Tyson, life suddenly revolved around tiny moments that new parents cherish, counting fingers and toes, watching their daughter sleep, and imagining the future that lay ahead. Like thousands of other families, they believed the hospital was the safest place their child could possibly be. It was a place filled with doctors, nurses, security personnel, and constant activity. No one could have imagined that it would become the scene of one of America's most shocking child abduction cases. Just hours after Carlina was born, doctors noticed that she had a mild fever. Rather than allowing her to remain in her mother's room, hospital staff decided to keep the infant in the nursery for observation. It was a routine medical precaution. No one considered it unusual. Joy expected to see her daughter again later that evening. She had no reason to think anything was wrong. Around the nursery, nurses continued caring for newborns, while anxious parents waited patiently for visiting hours. Everything appeared completely normal. Then, sometime during the evening, a woman entered the maternity area. Several people would later remember seeing her. She appeared calm. She seemed confident. According to witnesses, she was dressed in clothing that made her look like a hospital employee. No one immediately questioned why she was there. Hospitals are busy places. Doctors, nurses, technicians, cleaning staff, and visitors move through the hallways every hour of the day. One unfamiliar face rarely attracts attention. The woman reportedly spoke with hospital staff as though she belonged there. She never appeared nervous. She never rushed. Instead, she blended into the routine of the ward. For a few brief moments, everything seemed ordinary. Then she walked toward the nursery. What happened next would change multiple families forever. Within minutes, the newborn girl was gone. There were no screams, no signs of violence, no shattered doors or broken windows. One moment Carlina White was lying safely inside the hospital nursery. The next, she had disappeared without a trace. At first, nurses assumed someone had moved the baby. Perhaps another staff member had taken her for an examination. Perhaps paperwork had been mixed up. Those explanations made sense for only a few minutes. As staff members searched the nursery, confusion quickly turned into panic. No doctor had requested the infant. No nurse had signed her out. No medical procedure had been scheduled. The realization spread rapidly through the maternity ward. A newborn baby had vanished from inside a New York City hospital, and no one knew how. If you enjoy true stories that uncover forgotten mysteries, remarkable reunions, and real-life investigations, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we explore extraordinary cases from around the world, stories that deserve to be remembered and victims who deserve not to be forgotten. When Joy White asked to see her daughter, she expected a nurse to return with the newborn in just a few moments. Instead, she noticed something unusual. The staff members who had been moving confidently through the maternity ward suddenly looked uncertain. One nurse checked the nursery. Another hurried down the hallway. Someone picked up a phone. Minutes passed. No one came back with Carlina. At first, Joy assumed there had been a simple misunderstanding. Perhaps another nurse had taken the baby for additional tests. Perhaps there had been a paperwork mistake. But the longer she waited, the quieter the room became. Then came the words no parent should ever hear. No one could find her baby. Within minutes, the atmosphere inside Harlem Hospital changed completely. Hallways that had been calm only moments earlier were suddenly filled with hospital employees searching every room, every storage area, and every nearby corridor. Doors were checked. Elevators were monitored. Staff members questioned one another, hoping someone had simply forgotten to record where the newborn had been taken. No one had. As the search expanded, another terrifying possibility emerged. This wasn't a medical mix-up. Someone had taken the baby. Police officers arrived quickly and began securing the hospital. Every available witness was interviewed. Doctors, nurses, visitors, and security personnel were all asked the same question. Had they seen anyone unusual? Several people remembered a woman who appeared to belong in the maternity ward. She looked comfortable. She moved confidently. Nothing about her behavior had raised immediate concern. Only now did investigators realize how carefully she had blended into the hospital environment. By then, she was gone. Outside, police searched the surrounding streets. Vehicles leaving the area drew attention. Officers hoped the kidnapper had not made it far. Every passing minute reduced the chances of finding the newborn nearby. Inside the hospital, Joy and Carl Tyson were living through every parent's worst nightmare. Just hours earlier, they had been celebrating the birth of their daughter. Now, they had no idea whether she was safe, or whether they would ever see her again. News of the disappearance spread rapidly across New York. A baby had vanished from what should have been one of the safest places in the city. Parents everywhere were stunned. If a newborn could disappear from a hospital, where was any child truly safe? Investigators launched an intensive search. Roadblocks were considered. Tips began pouring in. Sketches were prepared based on witness descriptions. Every lead, no matter how small, was pursued. But as the first night came to an end, there was still no sign of Carlina White. No ransom demand. No phone calls. No credible sightings. Only a family left with an empty crib. And questions that seemed impossible to answer. As dawn broke over New York City, detectives faced a chilling reality. The longer Carlina remained missing, the harder she would be to find, and they had no way of knowing that this investigation would continue. Not for days, not for months, but for more than 23 years. In the days that followed, New York City became consumed by a single question. Where was Carlina White? Detectives worked around the clock. Officers revisited every hallway inside Harlem Hospital, hoping someone had overlooked a detail. During those first chaotic hours, every employee was interviewed, many of them more than once. Investigators carefully reconstructed the timeline, minute by minute. Who entered the maternity ward? Who left? Who had spoken to the mysterious woman? Who had actually seen her carrying a baby? The answers were frustratingly incomplete. Witnesses agreed on one thing. There had been a woman who appeared to belong inside the hospital. She was calm, confident. She never looked like someone committing a crime. That confidence may have been her greatest disguise. One detective later described the kidnapping as remarkably calculated. The abductor hadn't forced her way into the hospital. She hadn't threatened anyone. Instead, she relied on something much more powerful: people's willingness to trust what looked familiar. That small psychological advantage bought her exactly what she needed: time. Sketch artists worked with witnesses to create images of the woman. The sketches were released to the public. Thousands of flyers appeared across New York. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Newspapers printed Carlina's photograph beside desperate pleas for information. Every ringing telephone carried a little hope. Maybe this would be the call. Sometimes it was. A neighbor thought they recognized the woman. Someone reported seeing a baby in another borough. Another caller insisted they knew exactly where investigators should search. Detectives followed every credible lead. One after another, they disappeared into dead ends. Weeks became months. Months became years. The investigation grew larger, but the trail grew colder. Then something unexpected happened. The public slowly moved on. New cases replaced old headlines. Television cameras stopped coming. Flyers faded under rain and sunlight. For many people, Carlina White became another tragic mystery from the past. But not for everyone. Joy White refused to accept that her daughter was gone forever. Birthdays came and went. Each one marked another year without answers. Every milestone became a painful reminder of the life that should have been unfolding. She often wondered simple things. Was Carlina learning to walk? Was someone reading her bedtime stories? Did she know her real birthday? Or was she growing up believing another family was her own? Those questions haunted Joy for years. What she couldn't possibly know was that somewhere else, another little girl was growing up with questions of her own. Questions that would eventually become the key to solving the entire case. But before that could happen, more than 2 decades would pass. And one seemingly ordinary decision made by a young woman would change everything while investigators searched for a missing baby. Life continued somewhere else. Hundreds of miles away from the headlines, a little girl was growing up believing she knew exactly who she was. She had a home. She went to school. She celebrated birthdays. She called one woman Mom. To everyone around her, she seemed like any other child. There was nothing about her daily life that suggested she had once been the center of one of America's biggest missing child investigations. As the years passed, the case faded further into the background. Detectives changed assignments. New officers inherited old files. Boxes of evidence were carefully stored away, waiting for the day someone might discover the missing piece. No one realized that missing piece was growing up. At first, the little girl never questioned the life she had been given. Why would she? Children trust the people who raise them. They rarely imagine that the adults closest to them could be hiding something unimaginable. But children eventually become teenagers, and teenagers begin asking questions. The first questions were small, simple, easy to dismiss. Why didn't she look much like the rest of the family? Why were there so few photographs from her earliest days? Why did stories about her birth seem to change depending on who was telling them? None of those questions proved anything. On their own, they meant very little. But together, they created a quiet feeling that something wasn't right. She couldn't explain it. She only knew that certain answers never seemed complete. Whenever she tried to learn more about her past, the conversations often ended the same way. The subject changed. Someone became uncomfortable. She was told not to worry about it. For years, she tried to do exactly that. She focused on school, friends, work. Life moved forward. Yet the questions never disappeared. Instead, they grew louder. Then another problem appeared, one that seemed completely unrelated at first. As a young adult, she began trying to obtain important identification documents. The process should have been routine. Millions of Americans apply for birth certificates and Social Security records every year without giving it a second thought. For her, it wasn't that simple. Every search seemed to create another obstacle. Every missing document raised another question. Records that should have existed didn't. Information that should have matched didn't. At first, she assumed it was just government bureaucracy. Paperwork gets lost. Mistakes happen. But the deeper she looked, the stranger everything became. She had no idea that, more than 20 years earlier, detectives had asked many of those same questions. The difference was, they had been searching for a missing baby. She was searching for herself. And very soon, those two investigations were about to become one. For years, she tried to ignore the feeling that something about her past didn't add up. But unanswered questions have a way of demanding answers. Eventually, curiosity became impossible to silence. She decided to start looking for the truth herself. It wasn't an official investigation. There were no detectives, no search warrants, no forensic teams. Just a young woman, sitting in front of a computer, trying to understand where she came from. She searched public records, read articles about missing children, compared dates, looked for anything that might explain why so much of her own history seemed impossible to verify. At first, nothing stood out. Hundreds of missing children, hundreds of heartbreaking stories. Most had no connection to her life. Then one photograph made her stop scrolling. It wasn't even a real photograph. It was an age progression image. A digital reconstruction showing what a missing baby might look like as an adult. She stared at it longer than she expected. There was something familiar about the face, the eyes, the shape of the nose. The expression, it felt less like looking at a stranger, and more like looking into a mirror. She tried to dismiss the thought. Millions of people resemble one another. Coincidences happen, but this coincidence refused to let go. So she kept reading. The missing child had disappeared from a New York hospital. She had been kidnapped as a newborn. The year matched. The approximate age matched. Even more details seemed strangely familiar. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to think the unthinkable. What if the missing child was her? It sounds like the plot of a movie, but real life rarely offers certainty. She needed proof, not assumptions, not emotions. Proof. Quietly, she began comparing every detail she could find with what she had always been told about her own childhood. Some stories fit, others didn't. The more she investigated, the more the contradictions multiplied. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. Then she made a decision that would change multiple lives forever. She contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She didn't tell them she was certain. She wasn't. She simply explained that she believed there might be a connection worth investigating. To the people receiving the call, it was extraordinary. Over the years, they had received thousands of tips. Most led nowhere. Many came from well-meaning strangers. Some were based on rumors. This one was different, because it came from someone who believed she might be the missing child herself. Investigators listened carefully. They compared the available information. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Still, there was only one way to know the truth. A DNA test was arranged. It would answer a question that had remained unsolved for more than 23 years. As the samples were collected, everyone involved understood what was at stake. If the results were negative, a young woman would leave with even more questions than before. But if they were positive, one of America's longest-running missing child mysteries was about to come to an end. Days later, the laboratory finished its analysis. Inside that report was a single answer. One answer capable of rewriting 23 years of history. For more than 23 years, the truth had existed, hidden, unchanged, waiting for someone to uncover it. Now, arrested inside a laboratory report. When the DNA results came back, there was no uncertainty, no room for interpretation. The young woman who had spent years questioning her identity was, in fact, Carlina White. The newborn who had disappeared from Harlem Hospital in 1987 had been found alive. More than 2 decades had passed. Yet the mystery was finally over. For investigators, it was an extraordinary breakthrough. One of New York's most famous missing child cases had finally been solved. But for Carlina, the answers brought an entirely new set of questions. If Joy White was her biological mother, then who was the woman who had raised her? If her real family had never abandoned her, why had she spent her entire life believing someone else's story? And perhaps the most painful question of all, who was she now? Across the city, another family was receiving the phone call they had dreamed about for 23 years. Joy White had imagined this moment countless times. Sometimes she pictured Carlina as a little girl, sometimes as a teenager. Eventually, she realized that if the call ever came, her daughter would likely be an adult. Even so, nothing could truly prepare a mother for hearing those words. "We found her." Not a photograph, not a possible sighting. Her, alive. The reunion that followed was emotional beyond words. The tiny baby Joy had last held inside a hospital was now a grown woman standing right in front of her. 23 birthdays had been missed. 23 Christmas mornings. 23 years of hugs, conversations, and memories that could never be replaced. There was joy. There were tears. There was disbelief. And there was silence. Because sometimes happiness arrives carrying the weight of everything that was lost. Carlina wasn't meeting strangers. She was meeting the family she had never known, yet had somehow belonged to her entire life. For the first time, she heard stories about the day she was born. She saw photographs she had never seen. She met relatives who had spent decades wondering whether she was still alive. Every conversation filled another empty space in her past. But while one family was finally being reunited, another family was beginning to fall apart. Because the woman Carlina had called Mom for more than 20 years was about to face the consequences of a decision made in 1987, and the explanation she would eventually give left many people asking the same question. How could someone convince themselves that kidnapping a newborn was an act of love? The woman who had raised Carlina was eventually identified as Ann Petway. For years, she had lived with the secret that began inside a New York hospital. To neighbors and friends, she appeared to be an ordinary mother. Few suspected that the child she loved was not legally or biologically hers. After the truth came to light, Petway was arrested and later pleaded guilty to kidnapping. She served time in federal prison. The legal case reached its conclusion, but emotional cases rarely end when the courtroom doors close. For Carlina, life became far more complicated than simply returning home. What does home mean after 23 years? Is it the place where you were raised, or the family who spent decades searching for you? There were no easy answers. She had gained the parents she had lost. At the same time, she was grieving the life she believed had been real. Both emotions could exist together, and they often did. In the years that followed, Carlina spoke publicly about rebuilding relationships with her biological family while trying to make sense of a childhood shaped by a lie she never chose. Her story became a reminder that finding someone is not always the end of the journey. Sometimes, it's the beginning of another. Today, Carlina White's case remains one of the most remarkable missing child recoveries in American history. Not because investigators discovered a hidden clue after 23 years. Not because new technology solved the mystery, but because a young woman had the courage to ask a question that many people would have been afraid to ask. Who am I? If she had ignored that feeling, if she had accepted every answer she was given, this case might still be unsolved today. One question, one search, one DNA test. That was all it took to reunite a family that had refused to lose hope. Some stories remind us how easily a life can be stolen. Others remind us that the truth has an extraordinary way of finding its way back, even after 23 years. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more true cases of missing people and solved mysteries and remarkable reunions. Because somewhere, another unanswered question may still be waiting for the person brave enough to ask it.